Hey everybody, my name is Colin McKibben, Lead Developer Advocate for SailPoint, and today I'm going to be talking about how to build advanced workflows in SailPoint. Now, workflows is a feature of SailPoint Identity Security Cloud that allows you to build complex automations within the platform to do other governance tasks that may not be capable out of the box with the current UI features. Now for this session, I'm going to cover a use case, a real-life use case that you might want to use workflow for. That way you can see how we would implement this in workflows while also leveraging some of the out-of-the-box capabilities that Identity Security Cloud offers. So the use case we're going to cover is how to grant temporary admin level permissions to a user. So there's a couple ways you could do this without workflows. One way might be to create a role where someone can request that role, and it leads to a manual work item where someone on your team would manually grant that admin permission to that user. If you want to automate that, you could install the Identity Now management connector. It's a loopback connector that exposes all of these user levels on SailPoint as entitlements within your system. So you could automate it using access requests and roles. But the way we're going to cover it is with workflows and forms to kind of show the power and flexibility that workflows provides. So to start, we are going to create a role that users can request access for that will then be submitted to our workflow so the workflow can complete the processing of that request. So in my admin portal here, I'm going to go to the roles and create a new role, and we'll call this temporary admin. Okay, and then for manage access, got to save it real quick. Now for manage access, we're not going to add any entitlements to this because there's no entitlements for the different user levels that you're going to see within Identity Now. So we're going to leave the access empty. We're not going to set any assignment criteria. The only thing we want to do now is allow access requests. And for this, we're not going to require an approval process. Our workflow is actually going to handle that approval process for us. So with all of that set, I'm going to save it, and I'm going to make sure to enable it. That way I can test it in my workflow. Now the next step is to leverage forms to give the requester the ability to give a reason why they need access, and then also the date they no longer need that access. And we're also going to create a form for the approver so that they can see the information that the requester sent, for example, why they want the access, when they no longer need it, and also allow that approver to either approve or deny the request with additional comments on why. So to create a form, I'm going to go to the global settings and then click on forms. And there's two forms we need to create. The first form will be for the requester. Okay, so now we're in our form builder, and I'm going to add a section header. This is going to tell the requester more information about what this form is for. You can set the header text style, so heading 2 is kind of a smaller text, but I want to make this bigger, so I'll set it to heading 1. And then a description to give the user more context about the form. And that's it. Click apply, and you can see that my section header has appeared on the page. Now that we have a section header, we need to add two input fields. So the first input field is going to be a text area that will allow the user to give a reason why they need access to the admin permission. So we want to use text area because that's a multi-line text field, and it'll allow for a longer description if necessary. So we'll give a name to this label. That will automatically populate the technical key for us, which we're going to need for our workflow. And we want to make sure that this is a required field. We want to have the user submit that reason for access. The help text just gives more context about this input field. And we don't need a placeholder text in this case because it's a free-form text field, nor do we need default text. So I'll click apply. And you can see we have our first input field, and the red star means that it's a required field. The last input field we need is the remove date. So I'm going to scroll down and select the date field because I want to make sure that the input is in an appropriate date format. So we'll call this remove date. Make it required. And give a nice little help text. And we don't need a default date, so we'll just apply that. And there we go. Our first form is done. Now you can preview this if you want, just to see what it will look like for the end user. And I think that looks good, so I'll go ahead and save that. Go back, make sure it's there, it is. Okay, so we'll next create the approvers form. And this form will be sent to the approving person who will approve or deny that access request. So once again, we'll add a section header to indicate to the user what this form is for. And give it a heading 1, and then a nice short description. And there it is. Okay, so next, we want to present the approver with information that the requester submitted in their form. So in workflows, there's a way to extract the data that was submitted in one form and provide that as input into another form. So to do this, first we're going to present the name of the requester. So we're going to make a text field, because names are usually only a single line of text. We'll call that name. This is not going to be an input field for the approver, it's just going to be informational, so we're not going to mark it as required, but we will give it help text. And we shall click apply. And the next step is, since we're going to be capturing input from the workflow, is to go to the Conditions tab on this input field. And I'll click on Manage Conditions, and this is where you can do some complicated stuff with forms to either present data or do some if-else logic about that form field. So the first thing I need to do is select Inputs and create a new input for this particular field. We're going to call the input requester name. What this input will do once we save it is it will actually provide workflows with a new variable that workflows can populate so that this form will have the data when it's sent to the approver. Make sure we click apply, and so we have that input set up. And then the next thing we need to do for this particular input field is set up a condition to disable the field so that the approver doesn't think they have to put information in. It's just for informational purposes only. So we're going to create a new rule, and to disable a field on a form, what we do is, in our if statement, we select the form input that we just created. So we say if requester name that was submitted by the workflow is not empty. So you can see there's a couple different operators. We're going to select the is not empty. So if there is a name, it's not empty, what we'll do is set up a couple of effects. So the condition up here will determine if the effects will be executed or not. So the first effect will be to disable our name field. And we will create another effect where we will set the default value for our name input. Set the default value for the name field on the form to whatever was provided by the workflows from that requester name input. Click apply, and you can see we now have a condition set up for our name input. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the remaining inputs that we need to set up. It's going to be a very similar process, so the next one we need to do is the requested user level. So what user level is the person asking for? We'll set up a new input for that. And then we'll go to our conditions and create a new rule. And we will disable it. Okay, so it's set up just the same as the name one. That's because we want to disable it, but present the information we received from the form, or the workflow. Okay, so we're starting to build out our inputs. The next input we need is the reason for the request. And that will be a text area field, because again, that can be multi-line. And then we will also disable that field because it's for informational purposes only. Okay. And I think the final informational field that we're going to be disabling is the desired expiration date. And for this, we'll use a text field because it's for informational purposes only. We don't need to validate that it's actually a date. And once again, we'll set this up as an input. And then also disable it. Click apply. Okay. Now it's time to set up some input fields for the approver. So the first one we need to do is configure the decision dropdown so that the approver can either approve or deny that access request. For this, we're going to use a select field because there's multiple choices that the approver could select. We're going to make this required. And we will require a selection. We'll make this a static drop-down picker, and that way we can select the values that we want the approver to choose from. So the two options are either to approve or deny. Okay. And then the final form field is a comment section for the approver to leave comments about why they approved or denied the request. So that will be a text area. We'll make that required. And click apply. Quickly preview this. So yeah, we can see we have the form right here. Yep, so we have our name, user level, reason for access, desired expiration date. Those are all informational. They'll be disabled when they're presented to the approver. However, the approver will have to make a decision to either approve or deny and leave some comments. Okay, so our forms are set up, and now we can actually get to the workflow section of this presentation. So that's just, it's good to see then that, Workflows doesn't operate within its own bubble. It does leverage a lot of the out-of-the-box things that Identity Security Cloud provides to enhance its capabilities. So make sure we save this. We don't want to lose that work. Okay, so now we're on the Workflows page. You can see here I have a list of all the workflows I've created. But for this, we are going to create a new workflow. You'll be presented with three options. You can either start with a template to get you quickly set up. You can start with a JSON file, which actually, the presentation I'm doing today, actually I have a blog post out there with the workflow JSON already prepared for you. So if you want to follow along after the presentation, you can always go to that blog post that I'm going to link to this presentation and just upload it directly here so that it's all populated for you. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to start from scratch. We'll give the workflow a name. And now we are presented with the workflow builder. So just a quick rundown of the things you see on the screen. So on the left-hand side are all of the actions or steps that you can apply to your workflow. So there's triggers. Triggers are what start the workflow for you based on some kind of event that's happening in Identity Security Cloud. There's actions. These are actions you can take within ISC to do something. And then there's operators, which allow you to control the flow of the workflow and determine how you want to execute certain actions. Now, every workflow must start with a trigger. So for this workflow, because we're asking users to request access to a role, we want to know when that role has been requested. So there is a specific trigger for this. It is the access request decision trigger. This trigger will fire an event whenever an access request has been approved and assigned. Now, since our role doesn't have any approval process, as soon as somebody requests that, it'll automatically be approved and granted to that user, so it will fire the event. However, Triggers offer the ability to apply a filter, and this is always a good idea to do in workflows because filters will prevent the workflow from being executed unless certain criteria are met. Now, this is important on certain actions like access request decision because there could be a lot of access requests being approved every day in your organization, but you only are interested in certain access requests. And so you don't want to invoke your workflow unnecessarily, causing more executions than you need. So filters will allow you to reduce the number of workflow invocations based on whether the criteria is met or not. Now, event trigger filters use JSON path expression. We have documentation on all the abilities and capabilities of JSON path. I'll encourage you to check that out. I'll put that in my post as well. But the particular JSON path we're going to apply to this trigger to make sure that it only executes this workflow when that particular role has been requested is this JSON path right here. So only if the requested item's name is temporary admin access, because that's what we called our role, will this event trigger or this workflow execute. So if it's for any other access item, it won't invoke the workflow. I'll go ahead and save that. Next, we want to get some additional information about the person who's requesting access. So the way to do this is use the, let's see here, the get identity action. So in our list of actions, I'm going to scroll down until I get to the get identity action. I'm going to drag that onto my canvas and connect it right below my trigger. And the get identity action allows you to specify an identity ID to get more of their attributes and details about them. Really what we're interested in is that user's email address because that's not provided in the event trigger event payload. So to populate the identity, I don't want to set a static identity. I want it to be dynamic. I want to make sure that I'm always using the identity that was provided in this event trigger. So I'm going to change it from enter value to choose variable. This shows up a screen for a JSON path expression. So if you're handy with JSON path, you could type that expression directly in this text box. But there's also a nice variable selector that allows you to quickly see what kind of data is being provided, for example, by the event trigger, and just select the field that you're interested in. So in this case, I want to use the requested for.id, so that will give me the information about the person requesting access. When I click save, you'll see that it does populate the JSON path for me. I didn't have to type that in myself. Next up, we want to send a form to the requester to ask for those additional details, such as why they need the access and when they no longer need that access. There's an action for that. There is a form action right here. We'll drag that onto the canvas and attach it below as the next step. And for this, to set this up, first thing we need to do is we need to select the form that we're going to send. So if I open up the dropdown, we'll see all of the forms that I have available in my tenant, but we're going to find the one specifically for the requester. Okay, I set that. Now for the recipient, again, you'll see it defaults to enter value, but I don't want to set a static identity. I want it to use the identity that's requesting access at the time of the event. So I'll change this to choose variable. And again, I'll open my variable selector. Make sure I'm on the step for my trigger, and then I'm going to get the ID of the person that requested access. That way it'll send the form to that person. You can set a notification subject, so when the user gets the email, it'll be more descriptive about what this email is for. You can modify the email body to provide additional information in the body of the email to prompt the user to click on that form so they'll fill it out. Okay, next we need to set a form submission deadline. So let's say the requester has 3 days to submit this form before it expires. The reminder body is just a reminder email that will be sent to the user in case they're reaching that deadline to submit the form. I'm just going to leave that empty, but we are going to set the form submission reminder. So we'll say after 2 days, send that user a reminder that they need to fill out the form. Okay, so the first form is configured. Right after that form is submitted by the requester, we want to fire off another form, and this form is going to be sent to the approver so they can approve or deny that request. So once again, we'll select the form that we want to send. In this case, it will be the temporary user level permissions for the approver. Let's see here. So for the requester name, okay, so requester name, you'll notice a little difference here compared to the first form. So if you recall the first form, the one that we send to the requester, it's just asking for input from them. However, the second form, the one for the approver, we actually set up some input variables where we're going to take that data from the first form and present it as disabled fields in the approver's form just for informational purpose so the approver knows who's requesting it, why they're asking for it, etc. So those input variables that we set up in that second form actually show up in the workflow form action. So we need to populate these so that that form has that data when it's being sent out. So the requester name is just the first and last name of the person requesting the access. So again, I'm going to select choose variable because I want this to come from the data at runtime. And we can get that name from the event trigger. So if I look at the requested for, instead of selecting ID, I'm going to select the name, and that will be the variable that will be sent for the requester name. The next input that we need to set is the user level. Now in this case, I'm just going to hard code it to org admin. But if you want to provide your users the ability to select other elevated permission types like help desk or source subadmin, this would be more of a dynamic field. But for this demo, really we're just targeting the org admin capability. So I'm going to hard code that to org admin. All right, so the reason for access. So again, this is coming from the first form, the form that the requester is going to submit. So I'm going to select choose variable, open variable selector. Now for the input, I'm going to open this dropdown to select the step for the first form. So this form is what's going to be submitted by the requester, and it's going to have this form data field, and in it we're going to see the reason for access and the remove date, which are the two fields that the requester must fill out. In this case, we're going to select the reason for access, and that will populate our reason for access input variable. Next up is the desired expiration date. Once again, I'm going to select choose variable, open the selector, click the drop down, select my form, and use the remove date as the input variable. All right, so now we're on to the standard form action criteria. So the recipient, who's going to receive this form. You could set this up as a dynamic variable. So for example, you might want to send this to the requesting user's manager, or you might have a list of Identity Security Cloud admins that you want to rotate between. In this case, I'm just going to select a static identity, which will be my identity, so that these requests always go to me so I can approve or deny it. Okay, notification subject, this will appear on the email. Notification body, just give me a little more context about what this email is for. And then a deadline. So we'll set this one for 3 days as well. That will give the approver up to 3 days to approve or deny the request before it expires. And we also have to set the reminder, so I'll set that one to 2 days as well. Okay, so the forms are now set up. So after we get the approval decision from the approver, we need to use an operator to determine what the next step should be. So we will go to operators, and we want to know if the approver approves or denies the request, how to handle the workflow. So if you recall, that form input for approving or denying the request was a drop-down field, and that will actually return text. It will return text back to the workflow. So we need to do a compare strings operator to see what that text is. So the compare strings operator allows you to compare two values that are both strings or text. So value 1 is going to be a variable, so I'll open up my variable selector, select the form 1 step, which in this case is the approver's response, and you can see all the form data here. I want to check whether or not what the decision was, whether or not they approved or denied the request. We have a comparison operator, so you can select equals. There's a lot of different operators to kind of compare the two values that you're setting up. In this case, I want to check for equality, so I'm going to leave it at equals. And for value 2, I'm going to hard code it to approve. Now that means if the approver submitted the form by approving the request, then it will execute on the true path. But if it's any other value, like deny or whatever, it'll go to the false path. So let's handle the false path first in the event that the approver denies the request. There's a lot of things you could do here, but we're just going to make this simple. We're going to send an email to the requester notifying them that the approver denied the request. So I'm going to use the send email action, hook it up to the false path. The recipient will be a variable. And if you recall, I did have to set up that get identity action to get more information about the requester. So we're going to get the email from the get identity action. We have a list of all the attributes for that identity. I need their email address. Okay, and then we'll use a subject. Now for the body, we can do some customization by inserting variables into the body to make it more personalized. So to begin, I'll start with some static text. So in my case, the approver is hard-coded, so I can just leave that as Colin McKibben, saying that I denied your request. You can insert some HTML in here, so I'm going to add some line breaks just to make the email prettier. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an inline variable to insert the approver's comments so that the requester knows why their request was denied. So to do an inline variable, you can only do them when the enter value option is selected on a text field. And it always starts with 2 curly braces. That denotes the beginning of an inline variable, followed by some JSON path to a variable that you want to insert. In this case, the comments from the approver, and then when you're done with your JSON path, you always close it with 2 closing curly braces. So when this email is sent, that inline variable will be resolved to whatever the comments were so that they will appear in the email. And then finally, since this is a branch, I'm going to use an operator called endStepSuccess to terminate the workflow in the event that it reaches the false path. All right, so now let's handle the true path. So if the approver approves the request, we need to automate the provisioning of that admin user level to the user that requested it. Now, there is no action, out-of-the-box action in workflows to set user levels. However, there is a very powerful action called HTTP request that allows you to invoke just about any API, whether it's SailPoint API or an external API, to do more than what is available out-of-the-box in workflows. Now, because we're calling a SailPoint API, we have to select the correct authentication type, which in this case is going to be the OAuth 2. For the token URL, you will set it up for your tenant, however you would normally generate a token for your tenant. In my case, I'm setting the tenant name to my tenant name, which is Devrel. And then I'm using the /OAuth/token endpoint to generate that token. Now you'll need to set a client ID and secret. This will typically come from a personal access token from some user or service account on your tenant. That way workflows can authenticate the request. So I have one handy. The client ID is not really a secret. It just identifies the credentials that you have created. However, the client secret is a secret. We don't want to expose that. So workflows actually does encrypt any data you put into the client secret. We'll select header for the credential location. That's what you'll do for SailPoint APIs. We'll leave scopes empty, and now we go to the request URL. So the request URL is going to be the endpoint that we want this HTTP request action to invoke. So there is an API in SailPoint for setting user levels. If I go to the API documentation, it's under the v3 APIs, specifically under, it should be an auth users. Here we go, auth user. So there's two endpoints for auth user. The one we're going to start with is the patch one, because a patch operation allows you to update a resource, or in this case, a user. So this is the patch endpoint for setting the capabilities of an identity within Identity Now. And you can see that the payload will allow you to set specifically this capabilities property, which contains certadmin, orgadmin, etc. So that's the endpoint I'm interested in invoking. So I'm going to set this up to call that endpoint. All right, so I paste in the endpoint path. So again, it's Devrel for my tenant using the v3 auth users endpoint. And you'll notice, since we're on the enter value selector, we can actually do inline variables within this text field. And that's very handy because in this case, auth users requires an ID of a user that you want to set the permissions for. So rather than hard coding it in, we can set an inline variable that will resolve to the person's ID that's requesting the access. Now, because this is a patch request, I'm going to set the method to patch. The request content type will specifically be JSON patch. And the request body is where we're going to give it the payload that it needs to give that user the orgadmin capability. So if you're familiar with SailPoint APIs, the patch operation will look familiar. It's just adding another capability at the beginning of their capability list, and that capability will be org admin. Okay, I'll save that. So that HTTP action will give that user the org admin capability as soon as it's executed. Now the next step is we want to automatically remove that access when it's no longer needed. So the user did provide us a date when they no longer need it, and we can use that date in the wait action to pause the workflow until that date has been reached, and then resume the workflow to remove the access. So under my Actions tab, I'm going to scroll down to the Wait action and hook that up. Now you're presented with a type of wait. You have a wait for and a wait until. In a production setting, if you're going to actually use this in a production environment, you would use the wait until. That way you can set the date and time to be the variable that the user specified in their form. So for example, form, whatever remove date they specified, right? So you would set that there as well as at the time variable as well. However, we don't want to wait a day for this test to work out. I want to show you how it actually works in practice. So instead of using the wait until, I'm going to use the wait for. This allows you to specify a duration to wait until you should resume the workflow. So for demonstration purposes, we're going to make this 1 minute. That's the minimum amount of time you can wait for. And that will say wait for 1 minute, and after 1 minute, continue executing the workflow. So once the wait step is finished and the workflow resumes, we need to remove that org admin access that we just granted the user. So the first thing we want to do is kind of a safety check is get the current access of the user just to see how their capabilities are set up. So once again, we're going to use an HTTP request action. Because this API is not an out-of-the-box action, we need to use it. So again, I'll quickly go through the setup here. You do need to add your client ID and secret every time. The request URL, in this case, it won't be the patch endpoint. It will actually be in our API spec, I'm looking here, the get endpoint. So the get endpoint will allow you to specify a user ID to get the information about that user, and in this case we're interested in seeing what capabilities they have. So once again, I paste that in and I use an inline variable to specify which ID I want to get the information for. And for the method, it's just going to be a get. And because of that, I don't need a set of request content type. Okay, next up, I need to do an operator to check the value. So this is going to be a compare strings. Okay. And for the first value, I'm going to insert some JSON path because the variable selector won't get me all the way there. So I need to check the capabilities that is at index 0 of that user's particular list of capabilities. Because if you recall, I'm adding the org admin at the beginning of their list. I'm checking if that's still the case, if the item number 1 is still org admin. Because if it's not, we have to do some special processing. So we're going to check if that value is equal to org admin. Okay, so what if that value is not org admin? Well, just to be safe, we don't want to attempt to remove whatever's there because it may be a user permission that should remain. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll send an email to an admin telling them to manually revoke that permission because this workflow may not be able to do it correctly. So I'll be that admin in this case. So I'll get the email. And just to help me understand what's being requested of me, I'm going to paste this body in here. And again, you can see I'm using an inline variable to dynamically create the body. And it's just going to tell me that this user no longer needs their org admin access, but the workflow couldn't do it automatically, so please manually revoke their permissions. Save that. And again, we will use an end step to terminate that branch of the workflow. And that's just a safety check. But in the event that that value is org admin, we can actually go ahead and then remove the access automatically. So once again, for the true path, I'm going to add an HTTP request. And the request URL will once again be the patch endpoint for updating the user's capabilities. So I will select the patch method. Request content type will be JSON patch. Now this body is going to look a little different than the one we used to give them access. In this case, we're removing the access, so the body is going to be the remove operation, and the path will be capabilities number 0. Okay. Once we do that, we want to go ahead and send another email, this time to the requester, telling them that their access has been revoked because it's been expired. So we do want to send it to a variable, and that will be the variable for, oops, wrong one, their email address. And just give them a nice little message in the body. And we'll save that. And then finally, we can terminate our workflow. And save that. Okay, so the workflow at this point is all set up and configured for this use case. So the next step is to test the workflow, make sure it's working appropriately. You want to make sure you test all the different edge cases, so make sure you're hitting all of the different branches to make sure they all work correctly. One thing to note though is that at this time workflows does not honor the event trigger filter. So whatever you put in here sometimes confuses people. They think that trigger filter should be working on their test workflow action. But it doesn't. It only works for live workflow executions. So just know there's a different way to test these filters, and it's in the documentation that I'll provide. Now when I click on test workflow, you'll see the entire workflow here. And if I scroll down, we have the workflow test input. It gives you a sample input, but you want to change this to more closely match the data that you expect to see coming into this workflow. In this case, the example stuff has requested items and identities that don't exist in my tenant, but I need them to be for actual identities so I can test this. So I have a test input that I'm going to copy and paste in here. And this test input is going to make sure that the requested item is for that temporary admin access, and that the requested for is for an actual identity in my system. Now this is a test identity. You probably want to use a test identity yourself so that you're not alerting real users in your system. Okay, so let's start the workflow test. And this is just a warning that says workflow tests do perform live actions in your tenant. So always test in your sandbox first and use use values and test data that isn't going to impact any real users. So when I start the test, you'll see it going through the different actions. Green check marks means that particular action was successful. You can see it's waiting on the first form, and that's because if I open up my email, you'll see that I've received an email to complete the form. Now, all the emails are coming to me, but this would actually be sent to the requester, and it will tell them to please fill out this form. So I'm going to copy that link. I am logged in as my test user, Edard Stark. And I'm going to open up that form right here just to make sure I have the right authentication. There we go. Okay, so as my test user, it's asking for the reason for access. And a remove date. So I don't need this access more than April 16th. And I'll submit that. Okay, successful. So if we go back to our workflow test, you can see that form 1 completed. It got the input back, and now it's sending the next form to the approver. So it's pausing there, waiting for the input from the approver. So if I go back to my email, here we go, we have another email. This time it's for me, the approver, as an admin, and I need to click on this to fill out the details. So as an approver, if you recall, I set up those inputs to give the approver more information about the request. So if you recall, we did set up conditions and rules to disable the fields and populate them with the information provided from the requester. So as an approver, I can see the name, Edard Stark. I can't modify it. It's just for informational purposes only. So I can see they're requesting the admin permission. They no longer need it on this date. You know what? I don't think he's the king, so I'm going to deny his request. Click Submit. And we'll go back to our workflow and just see how it executed the paths. So like I said, you want to test all of your paths, make sure all the branches are executing correctly. So in this case, because I denied it, and when it got to this compare strings, this first compare strings is checking whether the approver approves or denies the request. Now because I denied it, it went to the false path, which is to send an email to the requester saying their request was denied. So if I go back to my emails, I can see that, yes, my request was denied, and the comments from the approver, which was an inline variable, which you can see was now resolved to whatever the comments were when I submitted that form. Cool, so our first comparison working correctly, the false path at least is working correctly. Now let's check the true path. What happens if I approve the request? So what I want to show you real quick before I start this test is, this is my test user's environment. Actually, let's go to my admin environment here. Yeah, so as an admin, I'm going to look up the current user level of Edard. So I'm going to search for him in the identity list. And we can see that currently he doesn't have any user levels set. That just means he's a basic user. Admin is not enabled, nothing is enabled. Okay, so nothing is enabled. If we go back to the workflow test, I can start a new test. You can see that it preserves my input that I supplied last time, so I don't need to set that again. Let's go ahead and start this test again. Okay, the first form has been sent. Just got to wait for that email. Here it is. So again, this is me as the test user. I'm getting this form. So I'm going to open it up as Edard. I do want to show you real quick before I fill that out. If you open this link as not the intended recipient. So whoever is the intended recipient for this form, if you open it up as anyone else, so example, if I just click on it and open it up as my admin user, you'll be presented with this error page. It's because the form wasn't sent to you. So what I do to test these things out is I open an incognito window and log in as the target user. And when I attempt to open these forms, I just copy the link, go to my incognito window, paste it there. That way it's opened up as the correct user. Okay, so I submitted my reason for access and remove date. Go back to the workflow test. Okay, now the next form is sent out. So this is for the approver. So if I look at my email, here we go. I'll open this up as the approver. So once again, I'm seeing Edard is requesting org admin access. That looks like a better reason to me. So I will approve it this time. And submit that. Make sure that goes through. Cool. All right, back to our test. So now we're watching the green checks, compare strings, and went to the true path. You can see the first HTTP request succeeded, and this was the one to grant that user level permission to Edard. And now it's waiting for 1 minute. So actually, if I go to Edard and I don't need to refresh, I can just edit here. You can see that the admin permission has been granted by that HTTP request action. So it's automatically granted. I didn't have to do anything manually, which is great. Workflow is waiting. If you set this to wait until the desired date, it could be a few days before this workflow resumes. But in this case, it's just going to wait for 1 minute for purposes of this test so we can see what happens during the cleanup phase. Okay, the 1 minute has passed, and we're coming down to the next request, which is to get the current capabilities of the user. We'll check the output here just to see what the output of that was. Capabilities, org admin, good. Now the second compare string said apparently that the JSON path I provided did not equal org admin. So it went to the false path, and it's going to tell the admin that, in this case me, that this user no longer needs org admin access, but the automation was unable to remove it automatically. So I need to manually remove it. It's interesting though, is I thought that should have succeeded on the true path. So let me check the condition that I set up there. Oh, I think I know why. I selected the wrong HTTP request action. I should have done this one. I think we got a minute left. I think I have time to test this one more time and see if we can get the true path to work. So copy my input. Paste it here. We'll start that. Real quick, I do need to set this person's user level back to nothing. Okay, look at our workflow test. So the form was sent. Bear with me, I got to get through this pretty quickly. Okay, we'll open this up. Good. Okay, the next form has been sent to the approver. That's me. So I'm going to quickly approve this. Good. Let's look at our workflow. Okay, it succeeded. So we should see, if I click on Edard, look at his user levels again. He's been granted the admin permissions. And if we can just wait about 1 more minute, I can show you how this automatically gets revoked. But the good thing is, I was able to show you the false path here as well, so that you could see that, yes, I tested that false path, that it works correctly, and I was able to debug that step. So again, just a good reason why you should always provide input that will test all of your different paths so that you make sure they work and you don't have any surprises in production. Should be another 20 seconds before this wait finishes. And yep, okay, so it finished. This time we got the correct body, so it should have automatically revoked that permission. In fact, so if I get out of there and I click on this again, you'll see, yep, admin has been automatically removed after the end date. So that works. So all the paths work, and yeah, I'm over time. So that's how you can get advanced with workflows, and thank you for joining.